Hey fearsome friends. Now I personally haven't had any scary moments on public transport. Not that I can remember anyway. I've definitely never had to use an Uber. But there's still time though, I guess. Now these stories, although frightening, let me know there are still good people out there, ready to protect their fellow human against some of the most despicable people out there. So sit back, relax, get cozy, comfy, warm, because it's time to let your nightmares in. This happened a few years ago, and sometimes I still have nightmares about not getting away. Let me start off by saying that I live in a pretty big city. Lots of bars and clubs, and I have experience with partying and drugs. I have been in blackout drunk situations, and this was not that, but I no longer go out on my own. That night I had decided to go out with some friends bar hopping. I mainly knew only one of the girls that I hung out with regularly, and the other two were more acquaintances. I was very outgoing and loved meeting people, so that was nothing new for me. We had a few drinks at a bar and continued on to the next one. We were having fun and a great time, when one of the girls I didn't know well pulled out the party stuff sometime during our second bar visit. I decided to skip it because I wasn't looking to get messed up that night, but my friend said yes, and she and the third girl went to the bathroom. The second girl, let's call her Barb, kept insisting I go with the two others. I kept declining, but she got a little aggressive after the third time I'd said no. My friend came back from the bathroom, and Barb acted like nothing had just happened. Then we met some guys who joined our group to have a flirt, and I was in a relationship, but my friend and Barb weren't. By that time, the second girl had left, and Barb and my friend were starting to get pretty messed up. I went to use the bathroom and texted my boyfriend that I was coming home soon, but saw that my phone was dead. When I came back to our table, the guys had gotten us shots. I was still pretty sober and declined the shot, but Barb shoved the shot into my hand, so to avoid a scene I took it. I then went to tell my friend that I was heading home, but I took one look at hers and Barb's faces, and I could see they were out of it. I was starting to feel pretty woozy myself at that point, so I grabbed all our stuff and started shoving them to go. The guys that bought the shots were protesting, but I wasn't getting any resistance from the girls. I hailed a cab, my phone was dead so no Uber, and I remember putting the girls in the back and telling the driver that we were dropping them off first, then going to my address. During the journey I blacked out, but I remember dropping off my friend. Then I blacked out again, and was alone with the driver. I was in the front seat and he was holding my hand. I looked around disorientated. I took in the sight of him holding my hand whilst driving, like he was my boyfriend or something. I saw my wallet in the center cup holder and the meter was off. He was telling me that he was taking me to a romantic place, but I told him no, and to please take me home as my boyfriend was waiting for me. He then said something along the lines of, "Stop talking about him, I told you." Which in hindsight indicates that I had told him already many times about him. He said he just wanted to pretend for a little, and held my hand tighter. I didn't want to trigger a violent reaction, so I left my hand where it was and started to reach for my wallet with my other. He saw me, let go of my hand and took my wallet from the cup holder to his other side where I couldn't reach it. I was still woozy and blacked out again, and when I came to my senses, we were parked near a very well-known, romantic and touristy location in my city. Normally this place is packed, but not that night. It's pretty far from anything else too, and surrounded by woods. I started to cry and begged him to please take me home, as I wanted to see my boyfriend, and that I wouldn't tell anyone what he was doing. He looked at me and said, "I will take you home if you pretend you are my girlfriend for a little while." I sat there in shock, wishing my brain wasn't mush. I wished, in fact, that I had never gone out in the first place. I wished I could see my boyfriend for the 1,000th time that night. I said okay, and he smiled, put my wallet back in the cup holder, and I took it slowly, putting it under my leg. He took my hand and looked out of the front window and out into the little lake that he had brought me to. He then started talking, but I don't remember what he was saying. I was just trying not to black out again. I waited for him to look at me and asked again for him to please take me home. He said only if I let him give me a kiss. I said no. He looked mad for a fraction of a second and squeezed the hand he was still holding. He then leaned in fast and kissed me anyway, but I kept my lips sealed tight against him, ready to fight, ready to bite and scratch and not go down easily. He let go of my hand and backed away, then started the car, and we finally began our way back to civilization. I was crying as silently as possible, trying not to be heard, so he would forget I was there and not touch me. I waited until we were near enough people that I could bolt out of the car and find another way home. But I think he saw me grabbing my wallet from under my leg and knew my intention to jump out at the next red light. He snatched it again and said he would drive me, so I just nodded, as by then I didn't care about the wallet, my phone, or anything else. I just needed to jump out no matter what, as I was going to get home. I had no clue what time it was by then either, but I do know there were almost no cars out in my usually busy city, no buses and no people. But I didn't care anymore. He eventually stopped at a red light, and I unlocked the door, yanked it open, ran and didn't look back. But I heard a car peel out of the intersection, and he was running too. My phone still dead, no wallet, so no money, and really far from my house. I was still drowsy and crying, and I had no idea of the time. I started walking then, when I heard a car pull up near me. I started running instinctively, when I heard a woman's voice yell out, "Are you okay?" I stopped and turned around to the most beautiful person I have ever seen in the entire world, walking towards me slowly, with her hands out in front of her, so as to not scare me. I started crying harder, being the most incoherent that I have ever been. She hugged me so hard and asked for my boyfriend's number so she could call him. He answered straight away, and she told him where I was, that I was okay and she was bringing me home. I cried the whole way back, trying to explain what had just happened. But still woozy, still freaking out, it was hard. So we drove in relative silence. When we got home, my boyfriend was waiting outside, losing his mind. My saviour gave me a phone number to call her when I felt better, and drove off. It was 5 a.m, and I'd left the bar at 10. That's all I can remember a week later, and my wallet showed up in my mailbox. So first things first, I'm not used to being alone. I have anxiety, and I struggle going anywhere without friends or family. I live in Australia, so school started a few weeks ago, and the way to school is one of the only things I can do by myself without freaking out. It's the same bus route every time, with the same students that got on every time, and I lived about an hour away, so I had to leave early. It was 7:34 a.m, and the bus arrived. I sat in the back next to a girl with hair similar to mine, which was shoulder length and a light dirt brown. We talked for about 20 minutes before she got off to go to her school, and I put my headphones in to listen to my music. I had it blaring to distract myself from my growing anxiety. And 12 minutes into the journey, a man with greasy long brown hair sat across from me. He had a briefcase and was wearing a suit that hardly fit him. He looked professional, yet messy, and I paid no mind and continued listening to my music, whilst scrolling through my phone. I was looking at Reddit posts, Animal Crossing, just things that take me into another world, away from reality. But it was a bad idea in this situation, it seems. One song ended and I snapped back to reality for a few seconds. I looked up so that I didn't miss my stop, and was still about 45 minutes away. The man had moved seats and was now sitting 2 away from me on the same row. I paid no attention as these seats were comfier, but I could hear him heavily breathing as I simultaneously felt his glance on me and my school dress. A lump in my throat grew, which was maybe an overreaction, but I'm always terrified of being sexually harassed or more. "Hey," he said, after roughly 5 minutes of staring. My eyes slowly moved to him as he glared at me, flicking between my face and my school dress. Now I'm 15 and in 9th grade, and I don't know if I look my age, but I definitely don't look younger than 14. Now looking at me with my mask pulled up more, he asked what school I was going to. I told him it wasn't any of his business, and asked him to leave me alone. But he didn't like my response. He asked how old I was, and I said 18. I don't know why I said that though. I guess I just didn't want to tell him my real age. He then began to move closer, slowly reaching for my bag that had my school logo on it. I grabbed it and pretended to use it as a pillow. He scoffed and picked up his briefcase, thinking I wasn't watching. I had glasses on, so the screen of my phone hid them a tiny bit. I then noticed he'd opened it and had taken out something small and silver. Now guns are illegal in Australia, so my mind immediately switched to a knife, and my suspicions were slowly confirmed. "Have you ever been hurt physically?" he asked. I nodded. I mean, who hasn't, especially in Australia? "Bad?" he asked. "No," I said. "At least I can't remember." He laughed, forming a pit of fear and sadness inside me. I peered up and outside of the bus, and I was still 20 minutes away. Students were sat at the bottom of the bus. I didn't recognize anyone, but they could still serve as a way of not being alone with this creep. Yet I was too scared to move. I peered over at him and he was still staring, the small silver knife glistening in his suit pocket. "You're pretty," he said. F off, I thought. You can't even see my whole face. I then felt his eyes on my chest. My chest was definitely developed more than a normal 15-year-old's was, as I had a fast metabolism. So I was skinny and had hardly any strength. Not unusual for a girl who spends most of her free time writing and gaming, or sleeping. But you could tell from my arms I wasn't ridiculously skinny, but not the opposite either. He was talking about random stuff, but I couldn't hear him over the sound of my heart beating in my ears. I took a deep breath and slowly came back to reality. "It's a shame you have school. I live near here," he said. Of course you do, I thought. "I'm not a sex offender either." What a stupid thing to say. He glared at me angrily like he could hear my thoughts. "Emily," I suddenly heard. It was music to my ears. My best friend Lily was standing on the steps of the back of the bus. I could see a smile of worry on her face as she placed her water bottle back in her bag. She was little, but she didn't take any crap, and she always had my back. She gestured to come to sit down with her and some others that I knew, so I grabbed my bag, covering the school logo with my hand. And once we sat down, I saw the creep was still staring. He stared at me the whole ride until we got off at a stop before school, so he couldn't find out which school I went to. And the bus was pretty full at this point, so he struggled to follow me. Once the bus left, I collapsed on the bench and cried on Lily's shoulder, feeling an overwhelming relief. I told her everything on the way to school. I knew he was going to hurt me, possibly kill me, and I'm so grateful for my best friend's great timing. When I was in college, I had to take public transit to early morning classes every other weekday. I really didn't mind it much. I was used to busing around the city, and it was early enough in the morning that the bus wasn't very crowded. I woke up at 6 and headed out the door for my early classes. I had one bus to the bus station, then another to the college, and there was about 20 minutes of wait time at the station. I made myself comfortable and found a bench near my spot, and was hitting my vape and listening to music for a while. I was interrupted mid-jam sesh from a man who was around 45 to 55 years old, tapping me on my shoulder. He was wearing a pair of blue jeans, white socks, and a grey construction jacket. "Hi, can I hit your vape?" he said. Before I could respond, he took it out of my hand and hit it. I smiled awkwardly and attempted to be nice, as I didn't want him to take off with it. The man was obviously strung out on something and didn't seem in the right mindset. He kept talking to me, even as I just nodded and made myself look as uncomfortable as possible. Before I could even process what was happening, he pulled out a knife and held his palm against my thigh, his fingers digging in deep enough to leave bruises. I was shocked. I didn't know what to even say. I carried a knife as well, but mine was puny and no good for sharpening a pencil, let alone self-defense. I held my breath. "Do you like my knife? I've had it for 10 years, he said. The blade glinted in the early morning light, and he smiled maniacally, hinting at his pleasure in my fear, and an almost unhinged amount of nerve. "Yeah, it's really cool. I collect knives too." He thought for a moment, softening his smile as he spoke. "You should see the scar I have. Here." He pulled up his left pant leg, revealing a deep scar from many years ago, gashed inches into his calf, the skin paper thin and twisted from time. "You like it?" Yeah, sure." My voice quivering, his knife drew closer. He brandished it in my face as he stated, "Oh, really? Well, maybe we should hang out sometime. Why don't you give me your number?" I felt vomit come up in my throat as he moved his palm higher on my thigh. "Hey, what are you doing? You were supposed to meet me 10 minutes ago." I heard a voice from behind me as a complete stranger grabbed my hand and pulled me into a hug. "Come with me," he whispered and pulled me away from the strange man with the knife. I didn't realize I was shaking as the other man walked with me, holding my arm and acting as if we were dating. He walked with me towards the end of the block and asked if I was okay. I just started crying. "Can you wait with me while I call my mom?" I asked him. I called her, begging to pick me up and let me stay home. She did, of course, helping me file a police report as well. But he never was caught. And if he was, they never did anything. "Well, did he threaten you?" "No, but he waved a knife in my face and grabbed me in a bus station. Apparently that's not a problem." Anyway, I moved away from that state a few years ago. And thankfully I never saw that weird knife guy again. This happened last summer, maybe at the beginning of June, and I was 17. I was on my way to get some camp leader training for volunteering abroad. And as I'm not very talkative with strangers, it takes some time for me to open up. I thought I'd get out of my comfort zone and learn something new. That day it was really hot outside, and I had at least 3 hours of travelling by buses and trains to get to my training. Once I got to the capital, I travelled by train and it was absolutely packed, so I couldn't sit down anywhere except by the door on the steps. So I sat down and plugged my headphones in, when a man got on and sat down uncomfortably close to me. I couldn't actually move because of him. Then out of nowhere he started talking to me. I pretended not to hear him while I looked out the little window, but he tapped my shoulder to get my attention. I was really nervous and polite, so I took out one of my headphones, hoping he just wanted to know when his stop was. So I gave him the benefit of the doubt and heard him out, but he asked me what I was listening to. At this point I could hear that he was kind of slurring his words, and his eyes were a little red and glossy. I don't think he had a face mask on either, so I kind of nervously shrugged my shoulders and gave him an eye smile, but he was still trying to do small talk with me. I wasn't really listening, just nodding, wondering how long I had to stay on the train. He constantly tried to get me to talk and answer to everything he said, and his tone became a bit passive-aggressive a few times. So after a while I was scared to not answer. At one point another man walked past us to use the toilet. I tried to give him a look of pleading, but they greeted each other as if they were buddies. I guess the guy talking to me probably didn't even have a ticket, because he stayed there the whole time I was on the train. After a while he went back to talking about my music, and said that we should each pick our favourite song and give them to each other to listen to. I was so creeped out, so I did what he asked. But then the chair hit the fan when he asked, "Why don't you take your mask off? I bet you're pretty." I was shaking, and then he extended his hand towards me and tried to take my mask off. I literally put my hand in a cross gesture to protect myself and said no. This is where he should have realized that I was uncomfortable, but surprise, surprise, he didn't. I don't know what he was thinking. I just chuckled very uncomfortably, and he tried this multiple times afterwards. I kept doing the cross wrist gesture to protect myself and saying no each time, and then he asked me to guess his age. I did. He said he was 36. Asked me and I said 16, hoping that he'd shut up or at least tone it down. But no. He got closer and examined the sleeve of my shirt, saying it was nice. I was almost peeing myself at this point, and then the train conductor was walking towards us. Thank God. Or not, because when I looked at him, almost tearing up, he just ignored me and walked away. The dude then playfully nudged the side of my thigh, whilst still complimenting me and trying to get me to take my mask off. Then he got up to get a cigarette and walked into the toilet, to be greeted by the dude that passed us earlier. He told me to let him know when I was getting off. Earlier he told me he was going somewhere further, and I convinced him I was going home, and my parents were waiting for me, as I heard that should make them not follow you or something. But he wasn't deterred at all by it. As soon as he went into the bathroom, and out of sight, I grabbed my bags, walked 2 wagons away from the one I was in, and finally took a few breaths, while people looked at me weirdly, as I must have looked a mess. When the train arrived at my stop, I booked it and kept looking over my shoulder at the train station, as well as walking down the street. I decided to change into my long hoodie, in case he was somewhere behind me, though luckily he wasn't. I called one of my parents on the way to my final destination, completely out of breath, and my other parent called me later to assure that I was all right. I haven't told any of the leaders at the event about it, and I don't know what would have happened if he hadn't have gone for that smoke. But I'm certainly glad he was stupid enough to hope I'd let him know when I was getting off. I'm a female, and when I was around 18, I flew across Canada to live in Quebec for the summer, in hopes of improving my French through a program I was accepted into. I was placed in a campus dorm in the middle of the city, so I was near the underground and would use it often to go exploring and shopping, etc. It was a Sunday around 2 p.m. The weather was nice out, and I needed to get to a store to buy some kitchen supplies for myself. As I made my way towards the underground, I noticed that a man with a briefcase, who had been on campus, was walking and heading into the same station as me, and also happened to be boarding the same train. I didn't go any further than to casually clock it in my mind at that point. As I entered the train, I noticed about 4 to 6 people together on one end of the car, so I headed to the other end. We had been told at the start of our program to mind our own business on public transport, don't hold eye contact with men, etc. So I sat down and minded my own business. But as I did, the man I'd noticed from earlier sat down next to me. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this type of seating, but he'd sat in a chair next to mine, so his knees were making direct contact with my left thigh. Being young, I thought, oh well, just mind your own business. So I stared toward the front of the car where the other group of people were, and didn't look at the man next to me, until about 10 minutes later. He had propped up his briefcase on his lap, and behind it had unzipped his pants. He had started touching himself. I could hear him breathing heavily, and I noticed the other group of people starting to stare in my direction. The looks on their faces gave it away. The next stop came and I jumped up, and all I could get out was a shaky, F off. He responded in French and acted oblivious, and so I ran to the security desk at the next stop and broke down, trying to explain in French what happened. I felt so alone right then, and begged my mum to let me come home early. After a week of crying over the phone, I finally got to fly home, and I hope that if I'm ever in that situation again, as either a victim or bystander, that I would handle the situation differently. I think back to those people staring at a child being harassed and doing nothing, and it makes me sick. Now, my country has a public transport vehicle chain called City Transport, which is basically a van, and this mode of transport could be, let's say, unsafe when taken at night. But since the fare was very affordable, I still chose to take it every day whilst attending my out-of-town college prior to COVID. Halfway through my first semester, I'd participated in an event that required me to stay on campus past office hours. And one night, as I was taking the same route from campus to my rental place, I found that there was already a man in the CT van, and he would be there every time I took it home. After a while, I became aware that this man seemed to be looking at me a lot. I would get the feeling of being watched, and as I glanced at him, it would seem like he'd just turned his head before I could catch him staring. It made me anxious, but I kept convincing myself that I was merely being paranoid. The following week, I was a little relieved when another person had started taking the same route, and it was a student from one of my classes. He would get off one stop before mine, but still, it eased my mind a little that I wouldn't be alone with the strange man for most of the ride. My classmate and I soon struck up a conversation, and we would chat every night until we arrived at his stop. One particular night, I was chatting with him as usual, when I realized that he'd missed his stop. I reminded him that we had passed it, but he just shrugged nonchalantly. However, when we arrived at my stop, to my surprise, my classmate also went to get off. Right before I got out, I accidentally caught a glimpse of the strange man, and he was staring at me and my classmate intently with a very furious look on his face. I'd even go as far as to say that he looked possessed. I only saw it for a split second, but it succeeded in frightening the hell out of me. After the city transport drove away, my classmate pulled me aside and asked if I'd seen the man who always rode with us, and I said yes. I then asked him why he was asking. "Did you see what he was holding?" I shook my head no. "He had a knife," he said. I was really shaken up after that incident, and since then I've always chosen another mode of transport if I'd had to leave after dark. I don't know what would have happened if my classmate hadn't noticed what that man was carrying, or if he hadn't chosen to get out at my stop with me. And I don't want to know. I'm just glad that nothing happened, and that I've never seen that man again ever since. So I have a bad habit of waking up early and reading subreddits similar to this, so I thought I'd finally share my creepy encounter. My friend and I had decided to go see some SoundCloud artist while I was on Shrooms and she was on Molly, not realizing what a bad state that would have us in. I heard around from the people in the venue that the artist we'd come for wasn't coming anymore. I was pretty bummed, but not enough for it to completely shift my mood. However, I started seeing things, like little shadow monsters on the ground, that were actually just flyers, and the atmosphere was just not it. I apologized to my friend because I wanted to leave, and she said it was completely fine. I asked her how she was planning on spending the rest of the night, and told me she'd called her sister to get her soon, so I called an Uber for myself. It arrived and I got in as a guy got in on the other side. I found this in no way weird, since I was in San Francisco and it was a Friday night. He said hi and asked how my night was going. I said it was fine and that I was just at the DNA lounge. But I started shivering at this point and the talking stopped. As we got onto the freeway, I swear my Uber driver's window was rolled down, so I asked him if he could close it. I then noticed the guy on the other side of the car give a little sideway glance at me, then was looking at his phone. He was dropped off, so now it was just me and the driver. I was now really worrying about asking him to roll up his window earlier, and apologized, but he said nothing. Just then I noticed my exit coming up, and he missed it. A little panic ensued within me, but I've had other Uber drivers miss my exit before, so I was just telling myself to calm down. He apologized, and I said it was fine, as the exit we were on led to the street down the other side of my house anyway. But he then missed my street again, and went back onto the freeway. At that point I screenshot my Uber ride info, ready to send it to anyone. He apologized again and asked if I was familiar with this road. I knew the area very well, so I replied, yes. It led back to where he'd taken the first exit, and the lane he was on merges. I was freaking out at this point, because his phone was there with the directions, and was right on the dashboard in front of him. He said he was sorry again and could cancel the ride if I wanted, allowing me a refund. But I declined and said it was okay. But he started pulling the ride info up, getting ready to cancel it, and I insisted that no, it's fine, as I was literally less than a mile away from home. I did get home eventually, and that was my first time doing shrooms. For years, I was married to a woman who travelled frequently for work. Occasionally, I would go with her on certain trips so we could enjoy one city or another. And during this particular event, she was working at a medical physics conference somewhere in the Washington, D.C. area. We decided to go up a few days early, so we could see the city and visit with some family that lived nearby. Now, I was going to be heading back that morning, whilst she stayed on to finish her conference. So I packed up, took my suitcase down to the subway station, and was riding the train to head back to the airport. A few stops in, a family got on the subway car I was in. A mom, dad, and a little girl that was probably around 11 to 12 years old. She seemed upset as she was sobbing slightly, but honestly, my cynical mind just assumed she'd had enough sightseeing, and as a child was upset. I watched her for a while, seeing her cry, and her mother tried to comfort her. She reminded me of my little sister at that age. Eventually she lifted her head, looked around and whispered something to her mother. Her mother stood up and came over to the seat across from mine, and said in her heavily accented English, she wanted to thank you for worrying about her. She doesn't speak English well. We went to visit the cemetery, and she feels very strongly. She is okay. Trying to hide a very distinct feeling of WTF, I just smiled and nodded. The mother rejoined her family, and we rode another 3 stops before they got off the train. As they departed, she waved at me, smiling lightly, and said something in a language I couldn't recognize. Her mother noticed my confusion and said, she said, "Thank you, Michael." Now, I didn't speak for the entirety of the journey, nor were there any identifiable markings on my luggage. I later figured out enough of the words to use Google Translate, and determined that this little girl had in fact said, "Thank you, Michael," in Estonian. So one of my classes at university ended at around 9 p.m, and it was winter, so it was already pitch black out. That night I stayed behind a while to talk to my professor about some stuff that didn't make sense to me, so I ended up leaving around 9:25 p.m. My university is a commuter school, so a lot of people don't drive there, but instead take the transit train, and it comes about every 20 minutes. I boarded the train at around 9:50, and it usually takes an hour to go and come from school, but at night it can take an extra 45 minutes. I take one train from university to downtown Calgary, and then wait for another train to take me to my neighborhood. The following incident occurred on the second train, at the second to last stop. Now, since my area is the very last stop on the line, the train is usually very empty by that time, apart from a couple of people who are also coming back from university, and of course some homeless people or crackheads who ride the train all night to pass time or to have some warmth. My car was completely empty, apart from this other student and one other woman, who I think was maybe in her 30s or 40s, and she was well dressed in a casual business type of outfit, so I didn't really pay much attention to her. The train had those seats where they face each other, so people end up looking right at each other if they don't stare out the window or ogle their phones or books. I was sitting on one end, and the woman I mentioned earlier was sitting on the opposite end of the car. As soon as the only other person in the train got off at their stop, which was McKnight Station, the woman got up, made her way down the aisle, and sat directly in front of me. At first she didn't say or do anything, and I was on my phone, when literally with no exaggeration whatsoever on my part, she leaned in so close to me that I could have probably kissed her forehead if I leaned in a bit and looked up. She was just sitting there, seemingly trying to determine what I was doing on my phone. She asked who I was, what I was doing, where I was coming from, what I was studying, and then she inquired about my headphones and asked if they were expensive, wondering how I got them. What scared me the most, though, was the way that I looked and the way I carried myself. You see, I had a leather backpack, a nice watch, was well dressed, had expensive, nice-looking shoes, so I genuinely thought I was going to be molested, stabbed to death, or both. And that's when my fears actually came true. Because this woman then put her hand on my thigh near my crotch and leaned in some more to give me the most creepiest half-assed smile I'd ever seen. What made it even worse, though, was that between the stops where she was going to be sat in front of me and the stop I was getting off on was the longest ever. It's about 10 minutes compared to the 3 to 4 minutes it took to get to other stops, and it felt like it was 30 minutes. My stop eventually came, and this woman even put her leg between the seats to try and stop me from leaving. But I just powered my way through and ran home as fast as I could, because I was terrified she'd pull up behind me or something. Now there is a mall in downtown Calgary that a lot of students from my university go to hang out with friends. And connected to this mall is Bankers Hall, which is exactly what the name suggests. It's also connected to other office buildings, and whenever I go to the mall with my friends after school, I sometimes see this woman sitting there with her associates, eating at the Starbucks. One time she noticed and recognized me, and gave me that same half-assed, creepy smile that she'd given me on the train that night. This story takes place when I was around 16 to 17 years old, and I lived with just my dad in a little apartment in a, let's say, questionable area. It was the type of area you'd not want to be out and about when the sun goes down. And up until a certain time, around 10 or 11 p.m., there would be a cop or two patrolling, making sure there are no gang-related activities going on. I had a job at a restaurant in the city, which was about a 30-minute car ride and an hour-and-a-half train ride. The train was a couple of blocks away from my place, and since my dad was always too lazy or hungover to drive me, that was my main form of transportation. I went to work around 3 p.m. and would usually get home around 12 or 1 a.m. This was my schedule for 4 days a week, aside from having school, and I would see a lot of familiar faces on the train because of this, but we never really made conversation with each other. Until one night when I got out of work late because some assholes wanted to sit in the restaurant past closing, so thanks to them I missed my train. The next one wasn't scheduled to arrive for another hour, so having nowhere to go and no money for Lyft or Uber, I sat there waiting. There was no one around, so when this older man showed up, kind of staggering a bit, I assumed he was another drunken hobo in the city trying to catch a train to sleep in. However, something about his face gave me déjà vu, but I shrugged it off, thinking maybe I'd just seen him on the train here and there. He made his way over to me, much to my discomfort, and started up a conversation. He wasn't slurring, but the way he was looking down at me gave me goosebumps. He asked me why I was out there so late all by myself. I had to reply as to not anger him. I mean, we were alone and he was close enough to me to pull out a knife or something. I told him I was waiting for the train, and he asked which one. Now the trains were color-coded, with a strip at the top to indicate whether it goes to north, south, east or west areas. I took blue, but I lied and said I took green. He looked at the schedule above the benches and saw that the green train was coming in 15 minutes, so he said he'd keep me company. For those extremely long 15 minutes, he asked me how long I had been working at so-and-so restaurant, which made my blood run ice cold. I'd never told him where I worked. I just looked at him and very timidly answered, "For a year." And he laughed and said, "Wow, it's already been a whole year, huh?" At this point my skin was itching out of anxiety, and as soon as the green train came, I knew I had no choice but to take it. I said goodbye to him and thanked him for the chat, hoping that would be the end of it. But no. He suddenly told me he took the green train too, so he followed me on and sat in my seat behind me. My mind was racing about whether he was going to try and do something to me, like chloroform me or hurt me some other way. But we thankfully at least rode the train in silence. I was trying to figure out how I was going to lose him, as there weren't many people riding the train at that hour, and our car was empty. As the ride went on in menacing silence, I could feel him staring down the back of my head. I waited until we got to a stop where there was another person, and I was so relieved to see a woman sitting there. She wasn't boarding though, so I immediately got off the train, and the man followed me as expected. I took a seat on the bench next to hers, close enough for her to see and hear everything going on, hoping she would catch on. The man noticed that I was sniffling, allergies and being out in the cold, and asked if I was sick. I told him no, but he insisted on giving me these weird pills he had that were supposedly cold medicine. I declined in a louder voice. "Sorry, I don't accept pills from strangers." This prompted the lady to look at us, and I made eye contact with her. She knew now. This went on until a blue train came, and the lady got up, giving me a look that told me to get on with her. So without explanation I did. She waved me over to sit next to her, and when the man tried to follow, she said, "No, you go sit over there," and made him sit a couple of seats across from us. He chose the one where he could face us and stared at me the entire time. I was shaking and about to burst into tears, when the woman leaned over and whispered to me that she had a pistol. I felt safer with her there, and we whispered back and forth about what had been happening. I told her where I lived and how I was worried he would follow me home. So she told me a friend of hers would be boarding the train soon, and when he did, she told me his name was Ray. Ray was filled in about everything and agreed to escort me home, and she promised me that I could trust him. The two of them waited with me until I got to my stop, and the man, still watching me, started to smile widely, resembling the Cheshire Cat. He shouted, "This is your place, right?" To which I didn't respond, and just gave the woman a hug and thanked her. Ray and I hurriedly hopped off the train, and as I looked back, I saw that the woman had pulled out her pistol and told the man to sit back down, even blocking the exit with her body. I finally let myself cry in relief, and Ray walked me home and tried to calm me down by telling me about his job and his family. After watching me get inside the gates of my apartment safely, I thanked him profusely for his help. It chills me to think about how that night would have turned out if I hadn't met up with that woman and her friend. I feel extremely lucky to this day. I never saw that man again and eventually stopped thinking about him. But in the back of my head, that creepy, aroused smile of his was burned into my mind, and I couldn't help but wonder just what else he knew about me. So one day I was on a bus that I get every day to go to work. It was a normal ride as usual, but I noticed a couple of guys get on that I'd never seen before, that looked to be in their early 20s. And they just gave me a slightly strange vibe, but I'm not sure why. Now I like sitting towards the back of the bus, because I don't like having anyone behind me, due to an incident where someone threw up once. So the two guys were sitting a few rows in front of me and were talking. Halfway through the journey, one of them got off and the other one put his headphones on. My stop was near the end of the route, and I got off at my stop as usual, bearing in mind that I had to walk past this guy to get off, and he wasn't showing any signs of getting up. I was walking for around 2 minutes once I was off the bus, and couldn't hear any footsteps behind me. But suddenly the guy was right next to me, saying hello. I jumped but tried to act as normal as possible, and his next words were, I noticed your tattoos on the bus. They're cool. Would you like to be my friend? I said sure, not planning on actually befriending this guy, but he seemed a bit unstable, so I didn't want to upset him, and he asked for my number so he could call me. I gave him a fake one, of course, and then got out of there as quickly as possible, and I thankfully never saw or heard from him again. Now, I have a lot of creepy stories, but I definitely remember this one the most. I was going to a different high school than the one that's closest to my neighborhood, and I had to get a transfer to do so. But I wasn't the only kid in my neighborhood going to that school way across town, so we all took public transportation regularly. Kids in the same neighborhood rode the same buses together, and it was cool, because it was a long bus ride with a couple of transfers in between. We got to know each other, have fun, and stick together on the journey to our neighborhood. One particular day we got out of school, met up and walked to the bus stop as usual. We all caught the bus together, and nothing was out of the ordinary. Our first transfer was at a mall. It's called a transit center, where lots of people get off, get on, or transfer buses, so there's always lots of people and activity going on. The buses stopped there for about 30 minutes, so we got off to go use the bathroom in the mall and hit the candy store up before catching our next one. On our way back to the bus, I noticed there was this strange guy watching us, and he was already at the transit center where all the buses were. We got on our bus, and I noticed that Chester, which is a name we gave creepy people, got on our bus too. I told my homegirl, and she thought I was just being paranoid and made fun of the guy. Now, this is the longest journey we had to make, because it went from north to south to another mini transit center rest stop, and more people got off and on, until we reached the South Transit Center. My friend group had dwindled from 8 to 3, and we got off and went to the convenience store to buy a drink. We had about 13 minutes before our last bus came, so we were hurrying up to try and beat everyone to the store. It took us about 10 minutes to get everything we wanted and get back to the bus stop. And again I noticed the creepy guy, but this time there's a lot less people on the bus. We were going far south, and more people got off. My last two friends were getting off before me, and that's when I got a really weird feeling. Creepy guy then came from the front of the bus to the back, where I was sitting, and I immediately felt uncomfortable. So I moved up 3 rows and to the right side, and there was now probably only 5 people left on the bus that were sitting up front. Creepy guy moved to the seat directly behind me, and not only that, he started rubbing his foot along the bottom of my seat. This startled me, and I actually thought I was tripping. But then he did it again. I moved again, and this time I took out my fillet knife and put it under my sleeve. Then he got up and got behind me again and started rubbing his foot under the bottom of the seat, but this time more vigorously. There were still 4 more stops until mine, and I was freaking out big time. When all of a sudden the bus driver abruptly stopped the bus and told the Chester to get off immediately, as he'd been watching him in the mirror. When he got off and we drove away, I shot him the finger, and the bus driver offered to drive me all the way home, since his route was close to my house. This happened back in 2019, when I was living in a small town in western Massachusetts. I had bought concert tickets, which included a meet and greet, for one of my favorite metal bands. They were performing at the Palladium on a September afternoon, and I worked in a town 45 minutes away from the concert, from where the concert was happening, and I had everything arranged for the big day. Unfortunately, my car broke down days prior to the concert, and the rent-a-car place didn't have any available vehicles for that weekend. My concert pal Jamal was working in Boston that day, so he was just going to meet me at the concert instead. Now, due to the circumstances, I decided to book an Airbnb for Jamal and I to stay the night, and I ended up taking the bus after my shift at the hospital had ended. I arrived at the bus terminal and requested an Uber to take me to my Airbnb, where I was planning to take a nap and change clothes before heading out to the concert. A grey Toyota Corolla that matched the description on the app arrived, and a very young guy greeted me and started the usual small conversation. I gave him vague answers, but it was inevitable for him to notice that I was a doctor, as I was still wearing my blue scrubs and Crocs. 10 minutes into the drive, the driver offered to buy me food at Chick-fil-A. I politely declined, but he ended up going to the drive-thru because it was on the way, and bought me a sandwich and a soda despite my refusal. He started asking me if I was single, the reason why I was visiting the city, and if I was travelling alone. I vaguely told him about the concert, avoiding giving much detail. Then he started talking about how he was driving one of his friends to Boston, and it was a shame he couldn't take me to the concert. He offered to drive me back to my Airbnb after the show had ended, and for free too. I didn't say anything. I was too distracted looking for the instructions on how to access the Airbnb that I missed the driver saving my phone number into his phone. After the concert, Jamal went to the parking lot to retrieve his car, and in the meantime I continued chatting with some girls I'd made friends with earlier, when I received a call from an unknown number. I ignored it and continued talking, but my phone kept ringing and ringing. I eventually answered, thinking it might have been someone from the hospital, as I hadn't got my work phone with me. So after the 5th time, I picked up and immediately recognized the voice. It was my earlier Uber driver, and he was inviting me to a friend's party. He said he was on his way to pick me up. My gut feeling was telling me how fishy this situation was, and I firmly said no, then hung up. 2 minutes later, the guy texted to let me know that he was 5 minutes away, and that I needed to wait for him. I paled after reading the text. One of the girls noticed how nervous I was, and after telling her my situation and showing her the text, she and her boyfriend decided to keep me company until my friend turned up with his car. The next morning during breakfast, and while chatting about the concert, Jamal mentioned that Jason, one of the guys we'd met at the concert, sent him a Facebook message asking him if we were okay. It seems that after we'd left, a group of 4 men in a grey car approached them asking about me. They decided to play dumb, telling them that they haven't seen anybody with my description, and they walked away. We reported him to Uber and deleted the app. But I kept receiving random calls from unknown numbers at odd hours in the night, so I decided to change my number to avoid any unnecessary trouble. No more Uber for me. So I'm not a tall guy, but I am pretty stocky. And a few years ago I graduated from college. To celebrate, I went to Europe, Germany, France, Belgium and England, and this was my first time being outside of the US, besides crossing the border over into Mexico. I was really happy that I was able to afford to go on this trip, and I wanted to share my good fortune with the poor of all the countries I was visiting. So I was giving mad money to homeless people, up to £20 sometimes. I met up with someone I'd met online in London, and we met up with some of his friends and hung out for a bit. After we were done, it was pretty late, and I was trying to find my way back to my hostel, when this guy came up to me and asked if I did cocaine, as he would sell me some right then. I said that I didn't do that stuff anymore. I had a roommate that I had to kick out for buying coke instead of paying his rent immediately before this trip, but that's a whole other story. And I wasn't going to be buying drugs from some weird dude in a country I've never been to before. The last thing I needed was legal trouble in a foreign country. But this guy just followed me around and wanted to talk to me. He was talking about God knows what, like how he's Muslim or something like that. And he offered to take me down some alley, saying it's historic because it's where Jack the Ripper brought his victims. I was of course declining these offers and told him that I needed to go, hoping he'd get the hint and go away. But no, he just kept talking and talking. I eventually decided to just order an Uber. And man, was I never so happy to see an Uber driver in my life. I even told the guy how he'd saved me. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.